This is a CBC podcast.
For years, men were disappearing from Toronto's gay village.
I feel terrorized.
I'm Justin Lang. This season on Uncover.
If we see this is happening, how can you not see this?
They suspected a serial killer. And they were right.
Police arrested 66-year-old Bruce MacArthur.
But this wasn't the first time the village was targeted.
You don't start killing at 66. You'd start killing when you're in your late teens or early 20s.
Uncover, The Village. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Ani, Tansi, Sego, Kwe. Hello, welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Wab Gijik Rice, sitting in for Rosanna Deerchild this week. Today on the show, something we don't talk about as much as we should.
The stereotypes of Indigenous men have been savage, of being violent, of being dangerous, and that then becomes internalized.
And then we see patriarchy come over with colonization, and this changes the way that men relate to women, and it creates a sort of a naturalized hierarchy wherein men become placed in positions of power over women.
To see somebody that looks different than them have long hair on top of that was the breeding grounds for a perfect candidate to be picked on.
Today on Unreserved, talking all about Indigenous masculinity. I'm still learning what it means to be a Anishinaabe man. I just turned 40, I have a son who's 2, and I want to raise him to be kind, respectful, and proud of who he is. So for help with that, I turn to one of the key people who taught me how to be a man, my father.
Bonjour, Zagaska Indigenous cause Makwanerodem, Wasauksing Bonjaba. My English name is John Rice, and I'm from Wasauksing First Nation.
That's my dad. He and my mom, Mona, raised me and my 2 younger brothers in Wasauksing First Nation near Parry Sound, Ontario. And he's worn many hats over the years: administrator, plumber, chief, drum maker, Medewin elder, and more. He now works for the Canadian Mental Health Association in Barrie, Ontario as a healer and liaison for Indigenous clients. He's turning 64 soon and has seen attitudes around masculinity change quite a bit over the course of his life. We're sitting in the basement, and he's telling me what he used to think being a man was all about.
From when I was young man in my late teens, early 20s, we followed probably the Euro versions of macho. The man is the ruler, the women and children are less than him. And even for that part, when I was younger, that's pretty much the way my peers on the reserve and myself believed. The women looked after the kids and did the cooking and all that kind of stuff while we kind of did hockey tournaments, baseball tournaments, and worked, of course. And one of the things you very rarely saw was a man helping out with the childcare. In fact, if we did help out, we kind of didn't want the other guys to know about that kind of thing.
My dad had a much tougher childhood than I did. When he was just 5, his father, also named John Rice, died in an alcohol-related boating mishap in Georgian Bay. He was only 29. That left my grandmother, Aileen Rice, to raise 5 children, all under the age of 7, on her own. She later adopted 2 more. My father credits being raised by a single mother with being able to eventually shake that macho attitude that prevailed amongst his peers.
I'm sure my mother was a big influence on that sense of family that I grew up with. Like I said, my sisters and I, we worked together to help my mother in the household. So that was part of what came out later on when my boys when they became toddlers and a little bit older. I became a little more dedicated to helping my wife raise them and look after them. But again, like I say, I wanted to spend more time with them. And looking after them was what did that for me.
My Anishinaabe dad and my Canadian mom raised me and my brothers in the mid-1980s and early 90s. When people in Wasauksing began reconnecting with Anishinaabe culture, language, and ceremonies. My father believes that also played a crucial role in reshaping ideas of masculinity in our community.
Picking up the culture again and the teachings that it conveys really helped, especially when we consider that the clan teaching was one of the ones that we were a bear clan, and I was responsible for showing my children what a bear, I had to learn the bear clan teachings in order to pass that on to them. But I didn't do that on my own. A lot of the ceremonies that we introduced in my community, we did that together. We did that as family. So that was fun. It was something we could all do together. And in some senses, we learned together.
A big part of that, my dad says, was making lifestyle choices like quitting drinking. He was able to make that transition by turning to the drum in ceremony. But it's not always that straightforward for other Indigenous men. A lot of them don't live long, healthy lives. Not many men in my family have lived into their 80s. But my father says future generations have inspired him to work harder to stay healthy.
Right now that I have a good number of years under my belt, it means to me that I've made lifestyle choices that now I can see my grandchildren and I can enjoy spending those times with them at the same ages that I spent with my sons when they were small. So I get to do it again a second time. And to be honest, having more focused on my sons and now my grandchildren, it encourages me to make these changes for my health so that I'm around longer and that they can have a Mishomis.
He says he and his friends didn't have discussions like that when they were young fathers. So I asked him if he could have ever imagined a future like what he's living today.
No, we didn't even think at that time. And I think even nowadays, a lot of men don't think like that. Women are really talk about becoming grandmothers, and women make a real transition when they become grandmothers. They have a whole new role. Us men, we don't talk like that, but I think it's a dialogue we've got to begin speaking about. And I think in terms of life promotion, living longer, if we talk in these terms of becoming a good grandfather, we can have longer, more enjoyable lives.
Still, there's a lot of work to do. Men in Indigenous communities across the country still struggle with intergenerational trauma and the ongoing impacts of colonialism. But my father believes just getting these discussions going can help many of them on a path to healing.
I think it's just a conversation of family, the conversation of roles, what a father is, what a grandfather is, and even what a great-grandfather is, because I'm sure at one time our great-grandfathers were around. So like even for me, at one time when we lived our lifestyle, my father would have still been here, and I could have consulted with him in those things that I need in my life. But for sure, conversation, dialogue about, not so much about being strong warrior types, but being Mishomis, a grandfather, and the things that we need to do to live long enough to have that.
That was my father, John Rice, also known as Zagasage. He's a Anishinaabe healer who works for the Canadian Mental Health Association. I was chatting with him at his home in Parry Sound, Ontario, right next to Wissahickon First Nation, where he and I both grew up. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Wab Gijik Rice, sitting in for Rosanna Deerchild this week. We're exploring Indigenous masculinity on the show today, and you can't talk about Indigenous men without talking about their hair. But for many young boys, their braids aren't just an expression of their culture, they can also make them a target.
Your last resort is to cut the hair, because it's not that you don't like your hair, but it's that you want the teasing and the bullying and the ridicule to stop. So the easiest way to do that is to simply cut your hair.
Still ahead, the founder of Boys with Braids explains why it's so important for young boys to be proud of their braids. But first, Indigenous men and masculinities is a topic my next guest has studied extensively. It's even the name of a book he co-edited. Rob Innes is Department Head of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan and an Associate Professor. He's also a member of the Cowessess First Nation, and he joins me from Saskatoon. Welcome.
Hello.
So, Rob, before we get too deeply into this, how do you define masculinity as it pertains to Indigenous men?
You know, the way to which I would define masculinity as it refers to Indigenous men is the way in which colonialism has really shrunken the various ways that masculine identities have been expressed into a singular form. The great range of masculine identities now have to fit the idea of the white supremacist heteronormative patriarchy. And if it doesn't adhere to those ideals, then these men are then seen as deficient. And that's when, men will start policing men on how to act and the proper way to be a man, to be tough, to be quiet, to be stoic, to be physically able to take on anybody who's a threat to them. And so, when we see the internalization of this ideal that is based on really this white notion of what it is to be men we see that Indigenous men can never achieve that.
You mentioned already that colonization has shrunken that definition of Indigenous masculinity. What changed for Indigenous men after contact?
For certain, the residential schools has had a huge impact on the way Indigenous masculine behaviors are expressed, the involvement of church, the views of homosexuality. But to say it's all residential schools is kind of ignores, there's a lot of Indigenous people that actually didn't go to residential schools. And so there were the stereotypes of Indigenous men of being savage, of being violent, of being dangerous, and that then becomes internalized by Indigenous men through education, through everyday interaction with white people. And that internalization has this negative repercussions.
Earlier in the show, we heard a chat that I had with my own father and what masculinity and being an Anishinaabe man has meant to him over the course of his life. One of the things he brought up was that he never was able to look into the future, and that he and his friends never really discussed being grandfathers together because deep down they didn't think they'd last that long. So how common of a sentiment do you think that's been amongst Indigenous men in Canada?
Well, I think that's very common because of the perception that Indigenous men are mentally, spiritually, emotionally deficient. That becomes something that is internalized. And with many Indigenous men ending up in the criminal justice system, in prisons, many Indigenous men are murdered. It becomes really difficult to start thinking long term, in terms of planning out your life, planning out, the way you should be acting. When I was growing up, career was never a word we used in terms of thinking about employment. A career was something we talked about when we were talking about sports athletes, right, in their careers. Yeah. so and that is a mindset that has been imposed upon Indigenous men.
And he also mentioned, my dad, that the patriarchy led to this sort of macho attitude that seemed to prevail in our community back when he was a kid. Usually when we talk about patriarchy, it's about the effect it has on women's rights, their health, and even survival, which of course is all huge. But has patriarchy also had an effect on men?
For certain, patriarchy is about exerting power, and certainly the one group that gets power asserted upon them through the patriarchy are women, but also men in terms of if men are supposed to strive to achieve a certain ideal, and this ideal is based on white, middle class, upper class men who have all the kinds of benefits of being in that kind of situation, it becomes difficult for Indigenous men to rise up on that hierarchy. There's a sort of like a glass ceiling. So they then have to exercise their power on Indigenous women, Indigenous children, grandparents, queer people, and other Indigenous men. And so it's through the assertion of power on other Indigenous men that we see that, a lot of the violence and a lot of the murders that take place happens within.
So to remedy that, Rob, how are Indigenous men nowadays redefining what masculinity means and what it should look like?
There's not a lot of avenues for Indigenous men to explore what it is to be men or what it is to be good relatives. And usually it starts to happen for Indigenous men a little bit later in life. They've lived a life that's, dysfunctional in a lot of ways, and they're becoming tired of that. As I said, there's very few avenues, but there are a number of places that are starting to offer a place for Indigenous men to do that. And, we see some in Ontario. The Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centers has a Be a Kind Man program, for example. A lot of these programs, though, are based on counteracting violence against Indigenous women, which is, of course, very important. But for some men who don't feel that they themselves are physically violent to Indigenous women, it doesn't really help them. But nonetheless, there are more and more places where Indigenous men are coming together. They're talking about what they've done and what has been done to them. Because, what a lot of Indigenous men have is a lot of shame. They're carrying a lot of shame of what they've done to people, what they've done to their loved ones, and what has been done to them as children. But for many years, they're taught not to deal with that shame, not to acknowledge it. And of course, that comes out in multiple ways, negative ways.
Now, Rob, your book came out a few years ago. Have you seen any changes in Indigenous men and how they perceive their masculinity?
This is kind of a new area. And so, what we've seen more is a growing number of Indigenous men ready to talk about this. And this is important because within the Indigenous community, we don't really want to talk about this. I taught a class a few summers ago, 11 students in the class, all Indigenous, and it was just after the RCMP report came out, and I said, there's a good possibility that the majority or the overwhelming majority of killers of Indigenous women are Indigenous men. And I asked what they thought about that, and every one of them said they believe that's the case. So I said, if that's the case, shouldn't we as Indigenous community talk about this more? And all of them said no. And they basically said no because they're afraid of what white people will say. But they didn't say that. What they said is this could reinforce negative stereotypes of Indigenous men. So what's happening now is that there are men who are coming out and talking about this stuff. It's still a small percentage of Indigenous men, but it's starting to grow more and more.
Rob Chmiigwech, thank you very much for joining us on Unreserved.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Rob Innes is an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Along with Kim Anderson, he co-edited Indigenous Men and Masculinities, Legacies, Identities, Regeneration. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Wabgishik Rice, filling in for Rosanna Deerchild this week. Still ahead, Lindsay Nixon explains how the toxic masculinity that came after colonization has had a lasting impact on Indigenous men.
It's not just that toxic masculinity hurts women in Two-Spirit, it's also hurting men, and it's further creating these places where the only sort of access they have to empowerment becomes to recriminalize themselves.
More on that in just a few minutes. Hip-hop artists often front, which means they portray an exaggerated version of themselves through their music. This can lead to distorted images of wealth, associations with gangs and violence, and gender. Professor Kyle T. Mays is a self-proclaimed hip-hop head. He writes and teaches on the subject of Indigenous hip-hop and how it intersects with ideas of masculinity. He is Black and Saginaw Anishinaabe. He joins me now from Los Angeles. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So are we. So first off, a lot of our audience may not be aware that there's hip-hop studies. What attracted you to this very niche area of research?
For me, it was really knowing about the impact of hip-hop on myself and countless friends, colleagues, and then I realized once I got to university that I could study something like hip-hop. So hip-hop studies as a discipline has been around really since the 1980s, but exploded with Trisha Rose's Black Noise in 1994. And from there's been countless books on hip-hop studies, hip-hop and English education, hip-hop and gender studies. So there's so many cool and interesting projects on hip-hop culture and its impact on youth culture as well.
And then you decided to approach this research from a totally new and very specific direction and then write about Indigenous hip-hop.
Yeah.
So what themes do you look at in your work?
The things that I really look at are the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity, or Black culture and Indigenous cultures. And I was very interested in looking at hip-hop artists and how they construct what I would call a modern Indigenous identity through hip-hop culture. You know, for many of us who grew up in a variety of Indigenous cultures, whether urban, whether on the reserve, etc., hip-hop has been a part of those journeys, especially for Indigenous millennials. And I wanted to just sort of bring that to light to particular audiences, both in Canada and the U.S. and elsewhere.
And in your book, Hip Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, you have a chapter specifically on masculinity in Indigenous hip hop. Mm-hmm. So how does representation of masculinity appear in this genre of music?
So it varies. So you might have Indigenous men who will utilize sort of these 19th century and make references to these 19th century male warriors, if you will. You have people who might adopt stereotypical versions of what we might call hip hop Black masculinity. and those who present more progressive forms of masculinity as well. So it's kind of three different versions of masculinities that are at play within Indigenous hip hop. And again, some are progressive and some are what we might call regressive. But I always like to emphasize that we can't blame hip hop per se for gender violence, etc. While it might play a role, if hip hop died tomorrow, which I certainly hope it does not, gender violence, etc., patriarchy would continue regardless of hip hop, even though hip hop does play a role, but it comes from a settler colonial society.
And these three types of masculinity that you've identified in Indigenous hip hop, these hip hop warriors, regressive warrior, progressive warrior, the 19th century warrior, can you explain a little more how they differ from each other?
Yeah, so the 19th century warrior masculinity might utilize tropes within their videos and use discourses relating back to historical moments. You mentioned Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, etc. in their music, in making references to freedom fighters from the 19th century at the height, especially through war and violence. Right, so that's sort of the 19th century, and they sort of adopt that and bring that into the 21st century. Then you might have regressive warrior masculinity, and again, they might utilize stereotypical ideas of black masculinity as portrayed in hip hop culture, sort of this indigenous gangster, if you will. Whether rocking bling bling, grills in people's mouths, on their teeth, etc., and saying very misogynistic, disrespectful things about women or homophobic, transphobia. And you also would have very progressive folks who try to avoid as much as they can issues of hypermasculinity within their music, who just sort of focus on, struggles that Indigenous peoples face, or just very playful and have fun as well. They're not really trying to be regressive about it. They're very progressive and just trying to demonstrate what it's like to be an Indigenous man today, or male identifying person today.
Getting back to the regressive warrior, why might an artist choose to present themselves that way with such a negative view of women?
I think some artists, you just kind of adopt it. So I think we have to remember, I think it's pretty global. So there are about 4 to 5 companies that pretty much determine what gets played on the radio, even though we have streaming services, or what gets advertised, right? And they understand that these images sell, these negative ideas of masculinity within hip hop culture, they sell. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, for artists to just sort of reproduce these negative ideas of what masculinity is supposed to look like. And so when you're trying to engage in this culture, you might just get into it. And it also depends on your particular circumstance as well. You learn issues of patriarchy, etc., from a society in which that's patriarchal, that doesn't respect and femmes, black, Indigenous femmes, etc. And you just adopt those things without thinking about them very critically. And I think with that, it's up to us to sort of sit with, negative behaviors even in hip hop culture, and be critical of what you're consuming, and then try to think very differently about the music that one might produce.
In your book, you also mentioned that feminism can help in defining Indigenous masculinity. What do you mean by that, Kyle?
Yeah, so I think reading about Black Indigenous feminisms is essential to one's own development. Also, being very keen to the people around you and people and women you don't know, Indigenous, Black Indigenous femmes that one doesn't know, and just trying to learning and developing how to relate better to people around you. And it's everyday stories, whether it's our grandmothers, our aunties, our mothers, our sisters, our cousins, like just learning and not always having a response, even if you're called out for certain behavior, etc., but just sitting and learning from their everyday experiences in the world. And also just reading about, different scholars and writers who write about these issues. I think that's very important.
And what Indigenous hip-hop artist do you think presents a progressive understanding of Indigenous masculinity?
I think a Lakota hip-hop artist, Frank Wallen, is especially one who does this very well. And I would also say Sacramento Knox and Southie, these two artists who make sure to present, alternative ideas of what it means to be a man. It's not always a comment on masculinity per se. I think it shows a certain sensitivity where you're not glorifying materialism. So talk about issues like water, right? And they actively try to understand their own masculinity and dismantle patriarchy. in their own everyday lives, but also in the music by talking about issues that impact all of us. And I think to me that's very, very important.
In your chapter, you mentioned specifically the song My Stone by Frank Waln. Why particularly does that tune resonate with you?
Well, one, just sort of the story behind that track. I remember first encountering it randomly on YouTube. I don't know. It really touched me because, one, he was talking about his mother, even talking to him about the track. He did it as a Mother's Day gift for his mother at a time where, you know, he might not have had the resources to give a particular gift. And so it really touched me. And I was like, I have to write about this particular track. Having a single mother, like, you know, growing up, learning as best as one can about what it means to be a man in this sort of oppressive society, and dealing with drugs and gangs and that sort of thing, and just trying to become a better person. And so for me, that was a really touching song. And I would even go so far as to say as a way to help me heal in particular ways. And it also reminded me of Tupac's track, Dear Mama. Just like, I love my mother, and this is a way for us to heal together.
Are you hopeful that more Indigenous hip-hop artists will challenge problematic stereotypes of what it means to be an Indigenous man?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I think idealism and hope are essential if we're going to keep progressing and moving forward, especially during this particular time. So I'm hopeful, but it's hard when, you know, certain companies, especially old white men, run how things are performed, and then it's hard to make money and be independent as an artist. And so, like, how do you make that balance? I'm hopeful that people will continue to sort of push against that, but consumers do play a role in that.
Very interesting work. Kyle Chimigwech, thank you very much for joining us.
Chimigwech, thank you for having me.
Kyle T. Mays is an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies and the American Indian Center at UCLA. His book, Hip Hop Beat, Indigenous Rhymes, is available now. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Wabgisha Grice, in for Rosanna Deerchild this week. We're talking about ideas of masculinity on the show today. And when you're on the topic, you can't ignore the worldwide Me Too movement and its impact on Indigenous communities. Lindsay Nixon is a writer and the Indigenous editor-at-large for Canadian Art magazine. Back in December, they wrote an article for The Walrus called Me Too and the Secrets Indigenous Women Keep. In it, Nixon unpacks how the Me Too movement is different for Indigenous communities. Lindsay joins me now from Montreal. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. How have you seen the Me Too movement make its way into Indigenous communities?
It's been more of so the Me Too movement in Indigenous communities has been more of a recent influx, I would say. I think previously, for many generations ahead of us, I think there was more of a unified front against colonial institutions. And as of late, it seems like there's just been more space opened up for young women, trans, non-binary, two-spirit, Indigenous individuals to talk about the complexities and nuances of misogyny and perhaps violence in their lives.
And why do you think that is?
I don't know. I mean, I want to say it has to do with the Me Too movement, but when I look at the writing, it's interesting. It was happening before the Me Too movement even. In the months preceding its sort of influx, like up to 6 months prior. And I try to pinpoint how or where it came from. I think there was just sort of a lot of affect amongst Indigenous feminists who were reading writers like Sarah Ahmad, and then also having conversations amongst themselves around kitchen tables, sharing knowledges about the fact that they had experienced a lot of violence and harm and hurt at the hands of Indigenous men in their lives. And perhaps this just not emboldened them, but gave them the supports they needed to start speaking more directly to these forms of hurt.
And those discussions have happened and are happening, yet stories relating to Indigenous women haven't really entered the mainstream like they did in Hollywood in very high-profile ways. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Well, I do think it's because we do really, as a community of scholars and thinkers, as writers, really take the teachings from our ancestors around survivance and mutual care. We did survive a genocide together, so I think that we still are a relatively close-knit group of people. And I think that we believe that those things primarily should be happening within the community, except in very exceptional cases. I should say critiques of masculinities and harm within communities should be happening within the community. But Many of us have Native brothers and fathers, and we know and have witnessed the increase of criminalization that they've experienced in their lives, and we would never want to bring those forms of also violence into their lives.
Is there a responsibility amongst Native men in particular to call out some of those bad behaviors?
Yeah, I think a lot about my close colleagues like Dallas Hunt, who doesn't do it for acclaim, but behind closed doors and privately is doing a lot of that work of calling in his male colleagues and talking to them about violence and misogyny and trying to transform the culture that way. And I have so many positive forms of masculinity in my life, like different men artists I work with who I respect deeply and have caring relationships to, like Sonia Sue and Jordan Bennett. And I think that they do something that's very self-focused. They focus on creating meaningful relationships with women, with Two-Spirit, with trans and non-binary individuals as a way of sort of subverting these patriarchal masculinities that can come into our communities.
In your Walrus article, you talk about how colonization influenced the way that Indigenous communities were structured and that, in effect, changed the roles of men and women. So how did colonization influence the way that Indigenous men saw their own role in community?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that, like, for my communities anyways, a lot of them were, if not matrilineal, at least led a lot by the desires of women communities. And then we see patriarchy come over with colonization, and this changes the way that men relate to women, and it creates a sort of naturalized hierarchy wherein men become placed in positions of power over women. And then on the other side of that, so like there's the hyper-masculinized, the hyper-nationalized, but then on the other side of that, like in the streets of North Side Regina, where like my brothers live, like they experienced extreme criminalization. And I see them doing this thing, like they kind of warrior up on the streets, but then get involved in street crime. And so it's not just that toxic masculinity hurts women and Two-Spirit, it's also hurting men. And it's further creating these places where the only sort of access they have to empowerment becomes to recriminalize themselves.
And you've mentioned your brothers a couple of times. Speaking more broadly about talking to your family and friends, how do you think Indigenous men think society sees them?
I mean, I think this is a sad conversation for me to have, and it makes me feel very emotional because I just think about the poor opinion that my brothers have of themselves, and they've learned from the state, and they've learned from foster care, and they've learned from settlers in Regina who just let them know what they think of them when they see them, that they just see not great people, and they have these really just like degrading point of views about them and the space that they take up in the city. And my brothers, they can't even look at people in the eyes sometimes, or like they can't even talk to people who are working at shops because they have such a low opinion of themselves. And I think that is also a facet of colonial masculinity, is that valorizes a specific kind of masculine presence and then also degrades Indigenous men at the same time.
What do you think then needs to happen to change people's perceptions of Indigenous men?
I love that there are resurgence movements where men are talking about reclaiming sensitive traditional masculinities within their communities and reclaiming roles that are inclusive of all spaces and communities and communicative with all spaces and communities. And at the same time, I think that we do need to talk about, just be open about sort of the outlier experiences. So, for instance, what does resurgent masculinities mean to my brothers living in Eastside Saskatoon, living in Northside Regina, who live in such a highly racialized and spatialized experience that they can't even have the privilege to access these teachings, let alone enact a resurgent form of masculinity. And I think that's why it's important that men should take on their own projects of resurgent positive masculinities, but also that we should be talking generally about the oppressive nature of colonial patriarchal masculinities, because it won't heal unless we're all talking about it and working towards changing the structures of our communities.
Has anything improved, do you think, when you take a look at your brothers or your other loved ones' personal experiences?
I think so, and I think that's happened twofold. I feel like my work going to university and publishing a book, and I feel like there's this thing about city Indians where often they feel ashamed of being Indigenous, so they won't dig into the specificity of their bloodlines. They just identify with sort of like a native experience in the cities where they live. But ever since I've been reclaiming these sort of like resurgent positive forms of our indigeneity, and reclaiming our teachings from our Soto, Cree, and Métis ancestors, they're starting to claim those things too, and just watching their language change alongside me, and how my research and my writing and my healing has emboldened my whole family to like really heal themselves. It shows me how yes, these things do need to happen on a macro level, but these are things that we need to be doing interpersonally in our relationships, in our communities, and within our families.
And it can often take a long time for us to realize that those images of ourselves were created by the education system, mainstream media, and so on, right?
Absolutely.
Well, Lindsay Chimigwech, thank you very much for joining us on Unreserved to chat about this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Lindsay Nixon is a Cree Métis Saulteaux writer and editor for Canadian Art Magazine. To check out their article from the Walrus, visit our website, cbc.ca/unreserved.
Va.
Are you a dinosaur?
No.
Are you a makwa?
No, I'm dinosaur.
You're a dinosaur.
No.
This is how a typical morning starts in my house. I eat breakfast with my wife Sarah and 2.5-year-old son Jequis. We talk about the day ahead and anything else on our minds, like dinosaurs. Sometimes, if we have time, Sarah will braid my hair. It's a nice routine that connects all of us to our Anishinaabe culture.
There, Mama. That one.
I'm doing your hair.
Doing it how?
In a ponytail, and then I'm going to braid it.
Do you want Mama to do your hair? No? I didn't have long hair when I was a kid, but when my dad started growing his out, I was inspired to as well. I started growing it more seriously in my late teens, and I've had long brown hair for most of my adult life. I see it as a way to honor my ancestors, specifically the boys who were forced to have theirs cut, or the men who were shamed to keep theirs short. We Anishinaabeg believe long hair is like medicine, and it contains our life experiences. It's like weengushk, or sweetgrass, which we also call the hair of Mother Earth. My son has only known me with long hair, and he sees this braiding routine as normal. What's Mama doing?
The hair.
Yeah, Mama's braiding Dada's hair.
Is it nice looking?
Yeah, nice looking. There.
Jequis' hair isn't long enough to braid yet, but his mom and I want to ensure he knows it's special and that he can grow it long if he wants to. So we make sure to include him in our morning hair routine. And when you do his hair, what are you doing?
Well, I get the tangles out first. Because usually he doesn't let me brush his hair after a bath. But it's pretty fine, so it doesn't take very long. So I'm just brushing it, parting it in the side there, and then...
Not quite long enough to braid yet, eh?
No, he only has like this little tiny 3-inch ponytail. Well, that didn't turn out quite like I wanted, but we're going to go with that today. Take what we can when he's 2. And all done, sealed with a kiss. Give me a quick kiss. Mwah.
Michael Linklater doesn't remember the last time he cut his hair, but he does remember being teased for it at a young age. Michael wanted Indigenous boys and men to be proud of their hair, so he started Boys with Braids, an online collective that celebrates Indigenous boys and their hair. Michael is Cree from Thunderchild First Nation in Saskatchewan, and he's a professional basketball player for the Saskatchewan Rattlers. He's here to talk a little bit about braids and what his hair means to him. Hi, Michael.
Hello.
Since our listeners can't see you right now, how long is your braid?
It goes about 3/4 ways down my back.
And what does it mean to you to braid your hair and to hold it and to have that represented?
My hair is a sacred part of my body. And when I was young, it was something that I was never aware of in terms of the importance of it. It was just something that I grew up having. And as I got older, I started to understand the importance of it. And while I was learning the importance of my hair, that's when the teasing came in, and there was a point in my life where I wanted to cut it. And so for me, as I got older, understanding that our hair is a part of our identity, and it's something that our ancestors didn't have the privilege of deciding whether they wanted to keep their hair or not, because it was decided for them when they were forced into the institutions that they were in. So for me, having my hair is really important to continue our traditions and our culture from our ancestors that have been passed down for generation to generation.
You mentioned that teasing and being tempted to cut it. How difficult was that as a child?
Kids are kids, and to see somebody that looks different than them is one thing, but then to have long hair on top of that was I guess the breeding grounds for a perfect candidate to be picked on. So on a daily basis, just walking through a hall or walking to my desk, there's a long braid down a kid's back, so a kid would just pull it. And so that's what really spawned the idea of cutting my hair. And so when I went to my mom and I told her that I wanted to cut it because I was being teased, my mother simply replied, she said, "Don't cut your hair, my boy." She said, "When you get older, you'll thank me for this decision." And she begged and pleaded with me, and I said, "Okay, I will listen to you." And I kept my hair, and yes, she was right. I thank her to this day for her discouraging me from cutting it.
You have young boys, Michael, who also have braids. What kinds of reactions do they get at school?
That's kind of where Boys with Braids came from. My boys have long hair just like myself. And when they came home one day, probably the same age, so it happened a few years apart. My oldest son is now 14. He's just finishing up grade 9. And my youngest is 10 in grade 5. But when they were in grades 1, 2, 3, they came home and said the exact same thing. "Dad, I want to cut my hair." Like people tease me, they call me a girl, they pull my hair. And so what had first happened was that I would go into the classroom and I would speak to the kids and I would say, this is why you're not supposed to touch the hair, why it's important, why it's sacred, and something that they want to be proud of. But what I realized with that is that I was having to do that every year. The analogy I use is it's like trying to stop a freight train with a BB gun. We need to start with the conductor, and we need to talk to the school boards, we need to talk to the superintendents, and then they need to pass that information down to their principals, and principals need to pass that down to their teachers. And the way I explain to teachers is that when a young man comes to you and tells you that he had his hair pulled or he's being teased, it needs to be dealt with in the same severity that you would deal with a sexual assault. Because growing up, we're told that our hair is a sacred part of our body and it's a private part that nobody should touch. And so for the non-Indigenous communities within the school systems, they need to understand that that's a private part of our body. And so if it's dealt with in that same severity, our non-Indigenous friends will understand how disrespectful it is and how much it impacts us when our hair is being pulled or when we're being teased.
And as you say, there's still a lot of work to do, but things are improving. These discussions are happening. How does it feel for you when you see boys and young men share their braids on social media?
It's heartwarming. I think there's a lot of young men who are very proud of their hair and their identity. And I think there's a lot of families that are still proud of their traditions and their culture. And anytime that we can celebrate that, it's very inspiring to see.
Okay, Michael Chimigwech, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's Michael Linklater. He created Boys with Braids, an online collective for Indigenous boys and men to share their stories and support for growing their hair. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. Rosanna Deerchild will be back in this radio space next week with stories coming to you all the way from Iqaluit. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. My name is Wab Gishik Rice in Sudbury, Ontario. Chimigwech for joining us this week.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.